Hello everyone, my name is Connor and I am the Music Fanatic coming to you guys with another video. Today is going to be a first part of a series of videos that I will be making episode by episode. It'll be a 5-part series and it will be basically me going over the last decades or so of music and saying what my top favorite albums are per year of that specific decade. Reason why I'm doing this is because the 2010s are about to come to a close. A lot of year end and a lot of decade end lists are going to be coming up. But if I did that, it'd be a little weird because I'm inconsistent with my reviews and my videos and everything. So I thought I'd just do a fun little experiment of going back from my music knowledge of when it very much began until up until basically this year until the end. Reason why I'm not starting with the 60s, by the way, is because I could, but it would just be me gloating about the Beatles the entire time. So I'm going to be starting with the 1970s, go to the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and finally finishing off with the 2010s of what my favorite albums are of every year of that specific decade. So let's not waste any more time and start with the year 1970. Before I actually start, by the way, I know I'm probably going to get a few comments about this. Seeming how I am pretty young, I'm only 22 years old, I was born in the year 1997. Some people could probably make the argument, well, how can you know anything about the music that happened in the 1970s or in the 1980s or even in the 90s if you were born in the year 1997? Well, I have a family that grew up in those decades and has music from there. I know what the internet is, and I own a shit ton of records, and I've listened to a shit ton of music in my life. I feel like I can make some opinions about this. Again, don't take this video as these are the best albums of this year or the best. I mean, some of them are honestly kind of objective, but this is all strictly my opinion. These are my picks of my favorite albums that came out in these years, either from when I listened to them when I was born, from 97 onward, or back a few years from what I've listened to and liked the most from what I've heard. Now, as I just said, I'm a massive Beatles fan, so you'd probably expect me to say that my favorite album of the year 1970 is this little album called Let It Be by the Beatles. Although I think Let It Be is an amazing album and I think the Beatles are amazing, that album actually really doesn't rank up that high on my Beatles catalog. I still think it's a great album, but I feel like the year 1970 had a bit of a more impactful album. Now, this band released their debut album, self-titled debut album, and they're basically the band that invented heavy metal, but I feel Paranoid by Black Sabbath is just a little more iconic. There's just so many different songs off this album that are just absolute bona fide classics that Ozzy and everybody in the band still plays to this day. I mean, Black Sabbath's broken up, but it starts off with War Pigs, you got Paranoid, Planet Caravan is not one of my favorite songs by them, I still think it's a good off this album, and then you got Iron Man, that's just the first side. Electric Funeral, Fairies Wear Boots, just this whole album is full of nothing but classics. It's my favorite album of the year 1970, and if anything, I think it's the best album of the year 1970. In the same year they gave us the best album by The Who, entitled Who's Next, we also got, in my opinion, which is tied for the greatest album of all time, we got Led Zeppelin IV. You got Stairway to Heaven, you got Black Dog, you got Rock and Roll, Battle of Evermore, nothing but bona fide classics. I reviewed it on this channel. You already know how I feel about this album. It's one of the best albums of all time. It's probably tied for the first place of my favorite albums of all time. It's Led Zeppelin IV. It's the best album in 1971. Probably the best album of the 70s in general. Best and my favorite album in 1971. So I have reviewed an album from the year 1972 on this channel, and that was Machine Head by Deep Purple, and though I think this album is incredible, and Deep Purple is one of the bands that personified the 1970s in hard rock and heavy metal and everything, and Machine Head is probably one of their best albums, David Bowie released his albums The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and The Spiders from Mars that year, and this album is just a bona fide classic that I cannot ignore, and I love it to death. I mean, it's so influential of what concept albums were to be, and honestly, it's my favorite era of David Bowie, the Ziggy Stardust era. Moon Age Daydream, 5 Years, Starman, It Ain't Easy, the song Ziggy Stardust, just classic after classic off this album. And it's my favorite album by David Bowie, and it is my favorite album of the year 1972. In the year 1973, one of the most iconic album covers, one of the most iconic albums, one of the best albums of all time, and one of the highest selling albums ever, and on the website entitled besteveralbums.com, it's their pick for the second best album of all time, we got The Dark Side of the Fucking Moon by Pink Floyd. By the way, it's just called The Dark Side of the Moon. But From start to finish, this album just flows like one continuous song. It has my favorite Pink Floyd song, Us and Them. It's just back to front a bona fide classic. I can put on this album any day and put it on, and it will never get old. That's my pick for my favorite album of the year 1973. No brainer. Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd. So basically, just to start off, my pick for my favorite album of the year 1974 is Sheer Heart Attack by Queen. I also probably could have picked Queen 2, to be completely honest, because that album was really good. But 1974 is a dud year, in my opinion. That's what I'm going to be calling years that, like, in music weren't exactly the best album-wise or song-wise. Like, I mean, I'm pretty sure albums in 74 were fine, but I couldn't really find any that I liked that much. But, yeah, Queen's Sheer Heart Attack is definitely probably my pick for my favorite album of 74. Killer Queen, Brighton Rock, Stone Cold Crazy, Misfire. It's one of my favorite Queen albums. It's my favorite album of 1974. So when I've talked about my vinyl collection before, I've gloated about this album a lot. The band Death for the whole world to see. If you don't know, they're a very, very early proto-punk band, and this album was recorded in the year 1975, but wasn't released until the year 2009. And had this album came out in 1975, it would be my pick for my favorite album of 75, but it came out in 2009, unfortunately. And if you haven't heard this album, you definitely should. The three brothers in this band just really personified what early punk sounded like, and it's just such a great album. The first few seconds of this album make you fall in love with it. Luckily, another amazing album came out in the year 1975, and that is Physical Graffiti by Led Zeppelin. Old songs that they had not recorded before, new songs that they recorded for this album. It's a whole bunch of different tracks. It's just classic after classic. We got Custard Pie, the Wonton song, fucking Cashmere, In My Time of Dying. Just so many great songs off this album. It's a double album, and it's over 85 minutes long, and it's just good from front to back. Not a single dud on this album. Physical Graffiti, Led Zeppelin. Best of 75. 76 was kind of a hard year to pick a favorite album, to be completely honest, because 3 albums came out that year that I thought were absolute classics. Like fucking 2112 came out by Rush. The Ramones released their self-titled album. But another band released their self-titled album that year that is my pick of 1976's not best album, my favorite album of that year. 2112 is probably objectively the best album of 1976, but Boston released their self-titled album that year, and this album is perfect from front to back and could be considered a greatest hits album by the band. From More Than a Feeling to Let Me Take You Home Tonight, there's really nothing bad on this album. You could play it any time of day, no matter where you are, and it will just be good no matter what. Tom Scholz and company just released a fucking absolute banger when they released this album, and yeah. Personal favorite song off this album is Peace of Mind, and that's my favorite Boston song of all time. So 1976, although it's a bit of a controversial pick, other than those other two that I said, Boston's self-titled album, my pick for 76. 2 years in a row, we kind of have not exactly this is a controversial pick, actually, because objectively, Rumors by Fleetwood Mac is the best album of the year 1977. Not only that, but Rocket to Russia by the Ramones came out that year, and that's my favorite Ramones album. But, in my opinion, the greatest punk rock album of all time came out that year, and probably my favorite punk rock album of all time, if you want to loosely say what albums considered are punk rock. Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols came out that year, and just listen to it. That's all I'm going to say. If you haven't listened to Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which, by the way, is the only album that the Sex Pistols ever released, I highly recommend it, because this is a perfect punk album, and it's my favorite. Well, I don't want to say it's actually my favorite punk rock album of all time. I just think it's probably the best, like, anarchic punk rock album of all time, and it's a great album. 78, we got a band that basically invented a genre. Van Halen I is an amazing album. Obviously, Van Halen I by Van Halen, the self-titled album by Van Halen, the first self-titled album by Van Halen. You know, David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, Alex Van Halen, and Michael Anthony all came together and made this album and released it. And it basically nearly invented glam metal and hair metal. And, I mean, Atomic Punk is a great song. You Really Got Me is a great cover. Running with the Devil is a great way to start off the album. Jamie's Crying, Ain't Talking About Love. Eruption is arguably one of the best guitar solos of all time. Just Van Halen 1. If you haven't listened to it, you definitely should. And now, finally, last but not least, the year 1979. So The Wall by Pink Floyd came out that year. Joy Division released their album Unknown Pleasures. The King of Pop released his album Off the Wall, Michael Jackson. But, you want to know what other album came out that year? London Calling by The Clash. Punk was already in its early days, like its stepping stone days. It was already a brand new genre nearly by that point, and it was like people already knew what punk rock was. And already in the year 1979, The Clash were basically rewriting the book on punk rock. And I have to give it up for that because this album is absolutely amazing. Like, so many different genres were encapsulated inside of this album, and from what would sound in the future to what has already sounded in the past, mixed with the punk rock quality that The Clash had, like from front to back, it is just a great album. And honestly, probably the best album in 1979. Oddly enough, when this album came out, a few years after it came out, people were trying to say to The Clash that it was the best album in the 1980s. It was released in 79, though. But yeah, that's my pick for 1979, The Clash, London Calling. And after I go through all my favorite albums of these specific decades, I'm probably going to try to pinpoint one specific album that I think personifies the entire decade. And that was a pretty easy choice. Though The Dark Side of the Moon was another choice I could have gone with, Led Zeppelin IV is just a perfect album and like the perfect 70s album. If you ever want to listen to what the 70s sounded like, listen to 1971's Led Zeppelin IV. Also, it's just one of the best albums of all time. So that is the first episode in this. The next episode is going to be on the 1980s, which is a strange fucking decade, to be completely honest. But a lot of really good, noteworthy albums came out in that decade too. So that does it for this video. That's my top picks for my favorite albums of the 1970s. Next episode is going to be in the 1980s. After that will be my favorite decade in music, the 1990s. Can't wait to make that video because I love the 90s. And that's pretty much it. So thank you for watching this video. Hit that like button, click that subscribe button. In the comment section below, leave me suggestions of albums that I should review. And that's pretty much it. 3, 2, 1, I'm done. Join me next time for the 80s. Subscribe.